The dancing plague of 1518 is one of the stranger and more unsettling occurrences to ever be recorded in history. It began when a woman stepped out onto the streets of Strasbourg, France, and without music or direction, began silently dancing. People were initially entertained, but things slowly grew more concerning when, after 6 days, she still hadn't stopped, and bizarrely, 33 other people had joined her, all dancing in eerie silence without rest. And if some sources are to be believed, this occurrence lasted for an entire month, with as many as 400 people suffering the same dancing madness, some of whom even died from exhaustion and heatstroke before one afternoon they all just stopped and returned to their daily lives. The dancing plague was one of the earliest recorded events of mass hysteria in history, and I've always been equally fascinated and creeped out by these occurrences. There's something so unsettling about entire communities of people falling victim to the same madness and delusion, as if reality itself starts to warp under the weight of human perception. And this, friends, is the very subject that's at the core of the unsettling, surreal, and captivating Paranoia Agent. Produced in 2004 by Studio Madhouse, Paranoia Agent tells the story of a city terrorized by a string of violent attacks, and the different effects those attacks have on various members of its community. While not an especially frightening show, Paranoia Agent is a show about fear, and how terror and hysteria on a mass scale can breathe life into fictional concepts. And if that sounds familiar to some of the themes we talked about in our Perfect Blue video, that's because it is. Paranoia Agent comes from the legendary mind of Satoshi Kon, writer and director of Perfect Blue, as well as other reality-bending works such as Millennium Actress and Paprika. And to me, Paranoia Agent is the distinct middle ground of these three properties, being more surreal and out there than Perfect Blue, but also far darker and more disturbing than Paprika or Millennium Actress. Paranoia Agent also has the distinct honor of being the only episodic series ever directed by Kon, and it shows. His distinctive creative fingerprints are everywhere, from the striking surreal visual direction to the unusual way its story is told. Rather than concentrate on one specific central character, each episode of Paranoia Agent tells a different story with its own distinct protagonist, with the cast of protagonists consisting of everything from school children to police officers to call girls. It's an unusual structure. In fact, the only other anime I've ever seen operate this way is Durarara. But while that show is about the serendipitous connections people make and how those connections can ripple throughout society in surprising ways, Paranoia Agent instead looks at how one tiny event can so drastically affect a community at large. And the event that sets all these distinct narratives in motion is the assault of Tsukiko Sagi, who's also the main character of our first episode. Tsukiko is a character designer and the creator of the massively popular Moromi, a small pink dog who has developed an obsessive Hello Kitty-like fan following. Tsukiko is under intense pressure at work to produce another mascot cash cow, but in a scene that I'm sure will be painfully familiar to any illustrators out there, Tsukiko spends her days slamming delete on her keyboard, erasing concept after concept, unable to come up with any fresh ideas. Pressure on Tsukiko mounts until one night she's walking home, exhausted and stressed to the point of collapse, when suddenly she falls victim to a brutal assault at the hands of a young boy, wearing golden rollerblades and wielding a bent metal baseball bat. Without a suspect or even a motive to work with, police are left baffled by the attack, and even wonder if it happened at all, until similar attacks begin occurring all over the city, all citing the same boy with the same twisted metal baseball bat. The story eventually gets picked up by the media, who give the attacker the inappropriately cute title Lil Slugger, or in Japanese, Shonen Bato, which are both silly names, so I'm just going to stick to the version of it inherent to my native tongue, which, due to 12th century British shenanigans, is English. This is the general structure of Paranoia Agent's episodes. We get a different main character struggling with some intense emotional crisis, who eventually falls victim to Little Slugger. But what elevates the show above its more conventional episodic horror contemporaries like, say, Hellgirl, is the unique way the characters of Paranoia Agent are written, as well as the overall story these collective narratives begin to tell. Basically, the character writing behind Paranoia Agent concentrates on two specific aspects of each of its characters: the reality and day-to-day struggle in which each of these characters live, and the fantasy of how they interpret this reality to themselves. And a lot of the horror of the show actually comes from this first part, the day-to-day reality of its characters. And if that doesn't sound particularly terrifying, that's because it isn't. Paranoia Agent doesn't really operate on the same spectrum of horror as something like, say, Perfect Blue. It's more that the ideas that the show presents are disturbing on a more human and relatable level, finding horror in subjects like social isolation, sexual repression, and abuse. And the advantage of utilizing such a particular style of horror with such a large cast of characters is that no matter who you are or what stage in your life you're at, you're likely to relate to at least one or more of the subjects the different episodes explore. For me personally, as someone who spent a lot of their career working in animation studios, the episode focusing on the disastrous production of the Moromi anime hit so close to home it was honestly a little chilling, watching as each member of the team slowly succumbs to the stress and panic in the face of impossible deadlines, and as they do, become victims of Little Slugger's vicious assaults. And the subject matter of these episodes can occasionally grow extremely dark, dealing with subjects like debilitating illness and suicidal thoughts. But I think just as unsettling as some of the topics the show explores is the unique way it explores them, and that is nearly with a kind of playful levity, which creates this intense feeling of dissonance in Paranoia Agent, as the tone of an episode clashes violently with the subject at hand. The primary example being episode 8, which is possibly Paranoia Agent at its most upbeat, but also its most disturbing. It's an episode centering around 3 online friends meeting up for the first time for a fun-filled adventure in the countryside, and there's a genuine air of hijinks and whimsy to it, until you realize what they're actually meeting up to do. The horror from Paranoia Agent comes from the show's unique take on exploring the darkest parts of living in contemporary society, and it's this grounded, reality-based horror that generates the need for fantasy that's present in each one of its characters. There's a quote from Satoshi Kon that I really like, in which he states, "A world a person perceives is filtered by their own fantasy and paranoia." And you can see this same quote reflected in every character of Paranoia Agent. Rather than the show telling us how we should perceive each of its characters, the series is instead more focused on how they perceive themselves and the reality around them and all the delusion and fantasy that comes with that. One of the most effective examples of this comes in episode 4, which tells the story of Officer Hirokawa, a crooked policeman who becomes indebted to the Yakuza and is forced to commit a string of robberies in order to pay off his debt and protect his family home. The really interesting part, however, comes from how the character interprets these events within his own mind. From his perspective, he's a kind of tragic hero doing what he must in a corrupt world for the sake of his family. But in reality, we can see he's actually kind of a piece of shit, a lecherous, greedy hypocrite whose penchant for alcohol and call girls is what led him to his current situation, not any nobler dedication to his family. The episode climaxes with this beautifully done scene that cuts back and forth between an old school Fist of the North Star style seinen manga, all while our protagonist commits increasingly heinous crimes. And it creates this amazing juxtaposition between the actions our character is carrying out and the fantasy of how he justifies it to himself. And this is a major theme throughout the characters of Paranoia Agent. Each one of them has some form of fantasy that they escape into when the burdens of day-to-day life begin to weigh too heavily on them. And the reason this aspect of the show works so well is it plays directly into one of Satoshi Kon's greatest strengths as a director. His ability to treat reality as a malleable, transformable thing, something that can warp and distort under human perception, and give that sensation visual form. This was the basis for a lot of the mind-bending visuals from Paprika, with reality shifting as the characters enter different states of dreaming, but the same technique is used in Paranoia Agent to illustrate the particular viewpoints of each of its characters, with each character's individual fantasy given specific visual treatment, such as Tsukiko, the character designer, whose Marumi plush will start moving by itself and speaking to her, distracting her from the torrent of abuse she regularly receives online and assuring her that everything will be okay. And I'm particularly fond of Marumi's animation in these scenes, as the animators actually take into account her disproportionate design, as she struggles to move around under the weight of her gigantic head. It's endearing as hell, but it's also a really interesting way of showing that a creature like this shouldn't physically exist, playing up just how disconnected from reality Tsukiko's fantasy actually is. Other instances of this involve a boy who's so consumed with the delusion that he's a holy warrior that the visuals of the episode actually transform to convey the fantasy-based quest he thinks he's on. Other forms of this visual manipulation are less direct, such as the visual change in tone for Detective Manua's episode. He's the assistant detective on the Lil Slugger case, and as the details of that case grow more bizarre and unsettling, he begins to become obsessed with it, to the point that his grip on reality steadily begins to loosen, and the visuals and sound of the episode distort to reflect that, with the look of the show warping into this overexposed, bleached out colorscape and sound design becoming scratchy and disconcerting, making for one of the more unsettling episodes of the entire series. The reason I'm drawing so much emphasis to the visual direction behind this show is I think it captures something that Satoshi Kon as a director arguably did better than anyone else, using the visuals in tandem with the narrative to help give us an understanding of the characters that would be impossible through just dialogue or exposition. And one of my favourite examples of this is in the story of Detective Ikari. While Paranoia Agent doesn't really have a main character, Detective Ikari features prominently throughout the series as the lead on the Little Slugger investigation. His arc concentrates on how the Little Slugger attacks affects his home and professional life. I can remember watching a lecture from an old police detective before, and he said something to the effect of, "There is always a motive for a crime, and if we ever get to the point where people attacking each other in the streets without reason is commonplace, then it won't just be a problem with the law. At that point, society itself will have failed." And the advent of the Little Slugger case seems to be bringing up similar sentiments in Detective Ikari. He's an old school police detective who believes in the cause and effect of crime and the virtues of good old fashioned police work. But as the case grows more bizarre and nonsensical, he starts to feel that his more traditional approach to law enforcement and his black and white views of the world no longer apply to a Japan of the modern era. And so he eventually escapes into a fantasy world of simple cardboard cutouts, depicting life in Japan during the 1950s, where good guys are cops and bad guys are burglars who carry large burlap sacks. And it's a section of the show that feels so beautifully charged with nostalgia and a desire to go back to a simpler time, which really puts across the exhaustion Detective Ikari feels from having to reorientate himself in a constantly shifting society. So essentially, what you have with this show is a group of characters all struggling with their own personal problems and using various forms of fantasy as an escape to those problems. And by having such a large and varied cast, we begin to see that this pattern is not unique to any one of Paranoia Agent's characters, but to society in general. Even very minor characters in Paranoia Agent seem to be looking for some form of escapism, from gossiping housewives to gross dudes who probably review anime on the internet. Oh God. And it's this need for fantasy where Little Slugger comes back into our story. I should probably mention at this point that if you want to enjoy Paranoia Agent completely unspoiled, then now is a good time to bow out of this video. I'm going to be keeping things as light on spoilers as I can, but to really dig into the meat of what this show actually is, some of the aspects of the plot, especially those regarding Lil Slugger, are unavoidable. As Paranoia Agent progresses, we can see the slow and steady spread of the Murumi character. In earlier episodes, Murumi appears in small and insignificant ways, minor pieces of merchandise such as phone charms, plushes, or on t-shirts. But over the course of the show, we watch as the mascot is slowly spread by the media, becoming the subject of news stories and getting her own anime adaptation. And as she does, the forms in which she appears begin to grow larger and more prominent. Murumi CDs, Murumi pillows, oversized Murumi backpacks, and finally, in my favourite shot of the entire show, massive Murumi floats hovering ominously over the city, nearly depicting her as some kind of grotesque pink deity. The reason Murumi's growth in popularity matters to the core of Paranoia Agent's plot is that Murumi and Little Slugger are essentially the same thing. As news of Little Slugger circulates, he begins to develop a kind of savior-like worship, as when someone is attacked by Little Slugger, the attacks invariably end up changing the victims' lives for the better. A woman suffering from a split personality wakes up to find her other self has vanished. A boy suspected of being Little Slugger is cleared of all suspicion after being attacked. And Tsukiko, the character designer, has the burden of her professional responsibility lifted as she can't be expected to work while injured. And just like Murumi, information about Little Slugger is spread through the media and online message boards. And as it is, rumours about who or what Little Slugger is begin to spin wildly out of control. And just like Murumi, as they do, Little Slugger's physical form begins to warp and change, transforming him into a massive, hulking, demonic creature. It's hard not to notice the odd parallels that keep being drawn between these two entities. Both are beings whose popularity is hypercharged through the media, both are entities that ultimately seem to bring people relief, and critically, both are creations of Tsukiko Sagi. See, Tsukiko was never actually attacked in the first place. Her injuries were self-inflicted, and Little Slugger is a figment she invented as an escape from her professional obligations. And that figment was then picked up and warped by the media and injected into an entire society of people, all hungry for a means to escape the hardships of their day-to-day life. Or, as Satoshi Kon puts it, in order to go through life, everyone needs something apart from reality. And in the world of Paranoia Agent, that something is Lil Slugger. An all-purpose, social and professional get-out-of-jail-free card at the mere price of a single self-inflicted injury. And this is what the series is really about. A society that causes people a systematic, mundane suffering, how that suffering creates a need for fantasy and delusion, and how that fantasy is then accelerated and spread by modern media. And what's really fascinating about this is that there is actual precedence for this kind of occurrence in Japan itself. During the late 70s in the Nagasaki prefecture, villages and cities were terrified by sightings of Kuchisaki Onna, the slit-mouthed woman, a tall, dark-haired female who hid a gaping, disfigured mouth behind a white face mask, and was rumoured to attack children with a pair of scissors as they travelled home from school. And bizarrely, despite there being no actual evidence of an attack of any kind ever occurring, sightings of Kuchisaki Onna grew so common and alarming that actual real-world precautions were taken. Escorts were set up to accompany children home from school, and actual police patrols were increased. In other words, an entire community of people grew so obsessed with a fictional concept that real-life action had to be taken. I wasn't able to find any mention of Kuchisaki Onna in interviews with Kon, but the similarities are so strong that I have to imagine it would have been an influence on the story of Paranoia Agent, at least on some level. But what's more striking about Paranoia Agent now is less the events that might have influenced it, but more so the ones it foreshadowed. Last year, we saw a wave of reports of supposedly violent clown sightings across both the UK and America, and initially this led to a string of copycat pranks, but it also did actually result in 2 real-life murders. There was also the strange case of Marina Joyce, in which a single conspiracy theory video centering around the increasingly unusual behaviour of a beauty vlogger sent an entire community of people into an obsessive paranoia-fueled witch hunt. What both these incidents have in common is a piece of information picked up by social media and then warped and hypercharged in a way that would have been completely impossible even a decade ago. And this is also the major difference between these two and occurrences like the Dancing Plague or Kuchisaki Onna. We now live in a time where information can travel infinitely faster and further than anything that was possible even a decade ago. And this is the future that Paranoia Agent envisioned. Paranoia Agent was released in 2004, 2 years before Twitter, 1 year before YouTube, and the same month that Facebook launched. In other words, Paranoia Agent aired just as the ways we spread and consume information were about to dramatically transform, and yet it predicted the kind of events this would lead to with such startling accuracy it's genuinely chilling. And it makes you wonder that if Satoshi Kon were alive today, what he would have made of our current information-obsessed climate, and what surreal and poignant visions of the future might have emerged from that. But as it stands, Paranoia Agent is special for me for 2 reasons. It's both a joyous and wholehearted celebration of the power of fantasy, while also being a deeply cynical take on how we consume and spread information. And I think it's this dual nature that gives Paranoia Agent a distinctive edge that I think honestly will never be replicated by any other show. But even more than that, Paranoia Agent stands as a brilliantly unique series from a true legend of the industry. Something that's equally dark, joyous, disturbing, and ultimately a fascinating look at a future that came to be. And this, to me, friends, is why you should watch Paranoia Agent. Friends, thank you for joining me today, and I really hope you enjoyed the video. I'd like to once again thank my incredibly supportive patrons who helped fund this video and as ever make this channel possible. And if you would like to do the same for no more than $1, you can do so over at patreon.com/supereyepatchwolf. This week I'd like to personally thank Golok, Didrik, Accidental Curlyfru, Kevin Bell, Amanda Howe, Arrow Pointing Left Matt, 40 Tentacles, and Beta is my name. Also, a quick reminder, I'll be appearing Saturday, November 11th at JCon in Dublin, so if you'd like to see me awkwardly stumble my way through my first ever panel, be sure to drop by. As ever, you can find me on the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast for our spooktacular Halloween special, where we'll be talking all things horror. Find me on Twitter at @eyepatchwolf, and as always, friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.